Before the bang in April of 1970, the United States had already walked on the moon, twice. Neil Armstrong had stepped off the ladder of the Eagle 9 months earlier. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean had followed him in November. By the time Apollo 13 rolled out to the launch pad, the great question of the space race had already been answered. And the country was in some quiet and slightly embarrassed way beginning to look elsewhere. Television networks no longer broadcast every step of the mission. Newspapers no longer ran the launch on the front page. The Apollo program, which only 18 months earlier had been the most watched human endeavor on Earth, was now competing with the war in Vietnam, with civil unrest, with the daily noise of a country trying to figure out what it was. NASA had a moon program. The moon program was working. People had moved on. This is the strange irony of Apollo 13. It was launched in near silence, watched by a smaller audience than perhaps any flight since Mercury. It was meant to be a routine mission, and it would become by the end of that week the most watched spaceflight in history. The 3 men assigned to fly her were not strangers to NASA, though none of them was a household name. JimLovell, the commander, was 42 years old. He had already flown to space 3 times. He had circled the moon in Apollo 8, the first crewed mission to leave Earth's gravity. He had spent more hours in space than any other living human being. He was a Navy man, a test pilot, the kind of person who could explain a complicated procedure in a quiet, even voice and leave you feeling that everything was under control. Fred Haise was 36, the lunar module pilot, a Mississippi-born aviator who had flown for the Marines and then the Air Force before joining NASA. This was to be his first flight. He had backed up Apollo 8 and Apollo 11, watching from the ground while other men flew. Now it was his turn. He was a careful, methodical engineer, and he loved the lunar module the way some people love old cars. The third man, the command module pilot, was supposed to be Ken Mattingly. Mattingly had trained for over a year. He knew the spacecraft called Odyssey as well as anyone alive. But 3 days before launch, the medical team learned that Mattingly had been exposed to rubella German measles by a backup crew member's child. He had no immunity. The risk that he might fall ill in the middle of a translunar flight was deemed unacceptable. Jack Swigert, the backup pilot, was called in. He was 38, a bachelor, a fighter pilot turned engineer. He had 2 days to prove he was ready to fly. He passed every test the simulator could throw at him. And on the morning of April 11th, he climbed into the seat that had been built for someone else. The moon they were heading towards was not chosen by chance. The target was a region called the Fra Mauro Highlands, named after a 15th century Venetian monk who had drawn one of the finest maps of his age. The highlands were of intense interest to geologists. They were thought to be made of material thrown out billions of years ago when a vast object struck the moon and created the Imbrium Basin, the enormous dark plain visible to the naked eye. Inside those rocks, scientists believed, were clues to the earliest violence of the inner solar system. Lovell and Haise had spent months training for that geology. They had walked through canyons in Arizona and lava fields in Hawaii. Their teacher was a Caltech professor named Lee Silver, an inspirational figure who had transformed the way astronauts thought about rocks. Silver had given them a way of seeing the lunar surface that was not just a checklist but a kind of language. They were ready to read the highlands. On the morning of April 11th, the Saturn V stood on Launch Complex 39 Pad A at the Kennedy Space Center. It was 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, and it weighed in almost 3,000 tons fully fueled. Was the most powerful machine humans had ever built, and it had never failed. The countdown was clean. The morning was beautiful, with the kind of high, gentle Florida cloud that lets the sunlight through without harshness. At 2:13 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time, the 5 F-1 engines of the first stage ignited and the rocket began to lift. The launch was to anyone watching perfectly nominal. Almost. 2 minutes and 43 seconds into the flight, during the burn of the second stage, the center engine of the 5-engine cluster shut down 2 minutes earlier than planned. The cause was a phenomenon called pogo oscillation, a violent vibration in the engine plumbing. It could have torn the rocket apart. Instead, the engine simply quit. The 4 remaining engines burned for an extra 34 seconds to make up the lost thrust, and the third stage compensated as well. Apollo 13 reached orbit on schedule. It was, the engineers would later say, the closest the Saturn V had ever come to a serious abort. And it was the first of many things that would go wrong on this flight. Engineering in spaceflight is a discipline of margins. Every system is designed with redundancy. Every component is tested to specifications that exceed expected loads. Every procedure is rehearsed until the muscles remember the motions. The margins are wide because the consequences of failure are absolute. There is no rescue from a vacuum. There is no improvisation that can replace a hull breach. The margins are the only thing standing between the routine and the unimaginable. When a Saturn V engine shuts down 2 minutes early, the margins quietly do their work. Other engines burn longer. Other systems compensate. The flight continues. The audience never knows. But the margins, like any savings account, can be drawn down. Every anomaly, every minor failure, every workaround eats into them. On April 11, 1970, the Saturn V used a portion of its margin to recover from a center engine failure. It got Apollo 13 into orbit. What it could not do was restore what had been used. The flight, in some subtle accounting, was already a little poorer than it should have been, but on that afternoon no one knew what was coming. The crew, after a smooth translunar injection burn, settled into the long quiet of the coast to the moon. The mission control room in Houston relaxed. The news anchors covering the launch began to file other stories. America turned away. In space, 3 men were drifting toward a moon they would never touch. The routine of going far. There is a kind of time that exists only in deep space. It is not the time of clocks exactly, although clocks still run. It is something slower than that. The translunar coast of an Apollo mission lasted about 3 days. During that time, the spacecraft moved at thousands of miles per hour. And yet, from the inside, nothing visible was moving at all. The moon grew slowly larger in one window. The Earth grew slowly smaller in another. In between, there was the long, gentle silence of a vehicle that was simply falling. For Lovell, Swigert, and Haise, those days passed in a quiet rhythm of system checks, sleep periods, meals, and the small chores of housekeeping and zero gravity. They tracked their fuel reserves. They monitored the cryogenic tanks. They updated the navigation platform. They slept in mesh hammocks. They ate freeze-dried food and drank water from plastic bags. They photographed the Earth and watched it grow smaller. The continents losing definition, the blue darkening into something almost ancient. By the 3rd day of the mission, on the evening of Monday, April 13th, the spacecraft was approximately 200,000 miles from Earth. The moon was very close now, looming in the forward window. They were less than a day from entering its gravity well. Lovell and Haise were in the lunar module Aquarius, which was docked nose-to-nose with the command module Odyssey. Performing a routine inspection of the spacecraft, they would soon ride down to the Fra Mauro Highlands. To mark the moment, they decided to do a television broadcast. It was the 3rd such broadcast of the mission, and like the previous 2, the major networks declined to carry it. In American living rooms, the channels were showing baseball sitcoms and the evening news. NASA's Public Affairs Office set up its own monitors, but the audience was small. Lovell narrated a tour of Aquarius. Haise demonstrated how the new and in-helmet drink bag worked, taking small sips of water in the middle of a sentence. Swigert showed off the command module's comparatively spacious interior. They moved slowly through the cabin, weightless, professional, almost playful. The broadcast lasted 49 minutes. As it ended, Lovell looked into the camera and offered the kind of small benediction astronauts often offered in those days. He said, in essence, that the crew of Apollo 13 wished everyone a good evening, and that they were closing out their inspection of Aquarius and getting back to a pleasant evening in Odyssey. He could not have known, but he had just spoken the last sentence of the world he was about to leave. The clock on the mission was now reading approximately 55 hours and 46 minutes ground elapsed time. The astronauts began the procedure of buttoning up Aquarius. In mission control, the EECOM, the flight controller responsible for the spacecraft's environmental and electrical systems, was looking at his telemetry. He noticed that hydrogen pressure in one of the tanks was reading low. It was a slow drift well within tolerance, but it was the kind of thing you wanted to clear up before the night shift came in. The standard procedure in such cases was to stir the cryogenic tanks. The cryogenic tanks held super cold liquid oxygen and hydrogen. Inside each tank were small fans that, when turned on, would mix the contents and give a more accurate reading. It was a routine procedure. It had been done dozens of times on previous Apollo missions without incident. The Capcom on duty was Jack Luzma. He keyed his microphone and said to the crew that they had one more item when they had a chance. He asked them to stir up the cryotanks. He also mentioned almost as an afterthought that he had some information about Comet Bennett, which was visible somewhere in the sky and which Lovell had asked about earlier. Swigert answered, "Okay, stand by." At 55 hours 53 minutes and 18 seconds, the oxygen tank 1 fans came on. 2 seconds later, the oxygen tank 2 fans came on as well. There was a small electrical disturbance on the stabilization control system lasting a fraction of a second, the kind of thing that in retrospect would matter. Inside oxygen tank number 2 in Sector 4 of the service module, something began to happen that no one in Houston or in space could see. The bang. The story of what destroyed oxygen tank number 2 began 5 years before the launch of Apollo 13. In 1965, during the redesign of the command module, the permissible voltage to the heaters inside the cryogenic tanks was raised from 28 volts direct current to 65 volts. This was a sensible engineering change. The tanks needed to be heated and pressurized more efficiently than the original specification allowed, but the thermostatic switches inside the tanks, the small devices designed to open and break the circuit if temperatures rose too high, were not modified to match. They were still rated for the old lower voltage. At 65 volts, the switches could weld themselves shut. The fact that they could no longer interrupt the circuit even when temperatures climbed past the danger point was a hidden vulnerability written into the design. This was not the only flaw in tank number 2. It had a small physical history of its own. It had originally been installed in a different spacecraft, then removed for modification, and during that removal it had been dropped about 2 inches. The drop had probably damaged a small fill tube inside the tank, although no one knew that at the time. The real damage came on the launch pad. During a routine test before flight, the technicians could not drain the tank normally. Something inside it was not working. To finish the test, they decided to use the heaters to boil off the remaining liquid oxygen. The heaters were left on for approximately 8 hours. During those 8 hours, with the failed thermostat unable to interrupt the current, the temperature inside the tank reached close to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The Teflon insulation on the wiring inside the tank cooked. It became brittle and damaged. Bare copper was exposed in several places. The tank after the test looked fine from the outside. It passed every subsequent inspection. It was filled with liquid oxygen for the flight. It rode the Saturn V up into orbit. It carried its damaged wiring across 200,000 miles of empty space. And then at 55 hours 53 minutes and 20 seconds ground elapsed time when the fans inside were turned on for a routine stir, the current arced across the bare copper, and a small spark caught in a tank full of super cold oxygen. Liquid oxygen does not so much burn as detonate. The pressure inside the tank rose very rapidly. Sensors recorded the temperature climbing off the top of their scale. At 55 hours 54 minutes and 53 seconds, the tank ruptured. The explosion was contained inside Sector 4 of the service module, the bay that housed the cryogenic tanks and the fuel cells. The energy of the rupture blew the entire side panel of the service module off into space. It also damaged oxygen tank number 1, which began to leak immediately. In the spacecraft, the 3 men heard a loud bang. The vehicle shuddered. The master caution and warning system began to scream. Yellow and red lights came on across the instrument panel. Swigert reached for his microphone. He keyed it and said in a voice that was calm but unmistakably tight that Houston, they had had a problem there. The phrase that would echo across half a century of popular memory was spoken first by Swigert and then repeated by Lovell, when Houston asked them to say it again. In the movie, in the cultural memory, it is rendered in the present tense as a problem still unfolding. In the actual transmission, it is rendered in the past tense as a problem already arrived. Houston, we've had a problem. The next 13 minutes were the most confused of the entire mission. The telemetry was a mess. Master Bus B was showing an undervolt. Then it came back. Then Master Bus A also dropped. 2 of the 3 fuel cells, which were the spacecraft's primary source of electricity, were reading dead. The 3rd was beginning to fade. Oxygen tank number 2 was showing 0. Oxygen tank number 1 was slowly bleeding out. In mission control, the flight director, Gene Kranz, listened to his controllers cycling through possibilities. Could it be an instrumentation failure? Were the readings real? Was the spacecraft actually losing oxygen? Or was the gauge broken? They could not yet tell. In space, Lovell drifted to the left-hand window. He looked out at the side of his ship. He saw a slow white cloud of gas streaming away into the darkness. It was unmistakable. It was the spacecraft venting itself into the void. He keyed his microphone and his voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a man working through a checklist. It was the voice of a man who had just understood something. He told Houston that they were venting something out into space. In mission control, in that moment, the room went very still. The flight controllers stopped reaching for hypotheses. The readings were not wrong. The spacecraft was dying. The shape of the next 4 days, although no one yet knew it in detail, had just become clear in outline. The mission to Fra Mauro was over. The geology samples would not be collected. The Apollo lunar surface experiments package would not be deployed. No one would walk on the highlands. The only remaining question, the only question that mattered, was whether 3 men could be brought home alive across 250,000 miles of empty space in a damaged spacecraft using systems that had not been designed for what was now about to be asked of them. The first hour after the explosion would later be remembered by everyone involved on the ground as a kind of strange, calm chaos. There were no raised voices in mission control. There was no shouting. The discipline of the program ran deep enough that even at the worst possible moment the controllers spoke to each other in their normal tones, asking each other for data, working through procedures, building hypotheses, discarding them. The same was true in the spacecraft. The crew, who had every reason to be terrified, sounded on the radio like men working a hard problem. They did not scream. They did not blame. They worked. This is the thing about disasters in highly trained teams. They do not look from inside like the disasters they look like from the outside. They look instead like a great many small tasks, each of which is doable, executed in sequence by people who know what the next task is. The disaster is only visible afterward in the totality. While it is happening, the team is doing what teams do. They are reading their instruments. They are talking to each other. They are saving what can be saved. They were on the far side of nowhere, 200,000 miles from Earth. And the systems that were supposed to keep them alive were bleeding into the dark. Aquarius becomes a lifeboat. In the first hour after the explosion, the engineers in mission control faced a problem that no Apollo team had ever faced. They had a crippled spacecraft, 3 living men aboard it, and roughly 15 minutes of usable electrical power remaining in the command module. After that, Odyssey would go cold. Its batteries, designed only for the brief re-entry phase at the end of the mission, would not last anywhere near the time required to get home. There was, however, another spacecraft attached to the front of Odyssey. It was small, fragile, and had been built to land 2 men on the moon, not to keep 3 men alive across the deep. But it had its own power, its own oxygen, its own water, its own engine, and its own life support system. It had a name as gentle as its function was about to become brutal. Aquarius. The water bearer. The decision to use the lunar module as a lifeboat was not a single decision. It was a chain of decisions made very quickly by a room full of engineers who had spent their entire professional lives planning for catastrophes that almost never happened. Now one had happened, and the plan was being written in real time. The flight director was Gene Kranz, a man whose face you would recognize even if you did not know his name, with a flat-top haircut and a vest his wife had sewn for him. He gathered his controllers and gave them an instruction that has become part of the vocabulary of the program. He told them they were not going to lose this crew. They would find a way to bring them home. Failure, in the way the public has come to quote it, was not an option. The problem was that Aquarius was never designed for what was about to be asked of it. The lunar module was a thin-walled, aluminum-skinned spacecraft meant to ferry 2 astronauts down from lunar orbit, support them for about 45 hours on the surface, and then carry them back up to a docking with the command module. Its life support system was sized for 2 men, not 3. Its electrical power was meant to last a couple of days at most, not the better part of 4. Its supply of lithium hydroxide canisters, which absorbed exhaled carbon dioxide, was sufficient only for the planned surface stay. To make Aquarius last long enough to reach Earth, everything would have to be stretched. Power would have to be cut to the absolute minimum. Heat would have to be sacrificed. Water would have to be rationed almost to the point of dehydration. And the carbon dioxide problem, which would not become acute for another day or so, would have to be solved with whatever materials were on board. But before any of that could begin, Odyssey had to be powered down. This was a delicate procedure. The command module's batteries had to be preserved with surgical care because those same batteries would have to wake the spacecraft up again at the very end of the flight when it was time to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Without those batteries, there was no homecoming. Swigert, working through a checklist that had been improvised on the ground and read up to him in pieces, began shutting down the systems one by one. The navigation computer, the radios, the instruments, the lights. As each system died, the cabin became darker, colder, and quieter. There was one piece of information that absolutely had to be carried from Odyssey to Aquarius before the command module went silent. That information was the alignment of the inertial guidance platform. The spacecraft's navigation depended on a gyroscopic platform that had been carefully aimed at specific stars. Without that alignment, the lunar module's computer could not steer the engines accurately. With it, they could fly home. Transferring the alignment from one spacecraft's computer to another's, while both were drifting, was a procedure that had been simulated but never executed under real conditions. Lovell, with a small slide rule and a pencil, did the arithmetic. He compared coordinates from the two coordinate systems. He carried the numbers across by hand. It was in a strange way a return to the navigation of old sailors who had crossed oceans with sextants and stars. He got the alignment transferred, and the platform in Aquarius came alive with the same orientation that had carried them out from Earth. Then they closed the hatch to Odyssey. The next concern was the trajectory. When the explosion had occurred, Apollo 13 had been on what was called a hybrid trajectory, a path that would take it around the moon but without an additional burn would not necessarily return it to Earth. The path had to be adjusted to a free return, a trajectory that, due to the geometry of the Earth-Moon system, would naturally swing the spacecraft around the back of the moon and bring it home. The burn had to be done quickly before the trajectory drifted too far to recover. The only available engine was the descent propulsion system of the lunar module, the engine that was supposed to land Aquarius on the Fra Mauro Highlands. It had never been used in deep space. It had never been fired with a command module dangling from its nose. There was no certainty that it would behave the way the engineers expected. Lovell took the controls. He aligned the spacecraft using the Earth in the window as a reference. He fired the descent engine for 30.7 seconds. The combined vehicle lunar module pushing command module accelerated slightly. The numbers on the ground showed that the trajectory had shifted onto a free return. They were going to swing around the moon. After that, they would have one more chance to refine the path home. In space, the three men were now living inside Aquarius. The cabin was cold. The lights were dim. The moon, which they had spent 2 years training to visit, was growing larger in the windows. They were going to fly closer to it than any humans had ever flown, and then they were going to leave it behind forever. Around the far side. The moon, when Apollo 13 reached it, was very close indeed. The trajectory took the spacecraft around the far side at an altitude of only about 136 miles above the lunar surface. That was lower than most lunar missions had passed. It was lower than Apollo 8 had flown. The three men in Aquarius were going to see the back of the moon in a way that few humans had ever seen it. Lovell, who had orbited the moon once before, had a particular relationship with the place. He had been there at Christmas of 1968 when Apollo 8 had become the first crewed mission to leave Earth's gravity and circle another world. He knew its gray cratered face very well. He knew its rhythms of light and of shadow. He had been for a brief time in 1968 one of the only 3 people who had seen the far side with their own eyes. Now he was about to see it again, and he was not going to be allowed to walk on it. In the hours before the closest approach, the spacecraft drifted closer and closer. The moon grew until it filled the lower windows of Aquarius, an ancient motionless presence beneath them. The light on the surface was very harsh since there was no atmosphere to soften it. Shadows were absolute black. Highlights were dazzling white. The terrain looked as it always did to those who saw it from low orbit, like a place that had been hit by everything in the universe and never repaired. Lovell had work to do, but he allowed himself a long look. He recognized features he had photographed 2 Christmases earlier. He saw craters he had hoped to see again from much closer from the surface, from inside a pressurized suit walking on dust. He did not say much about it on the radio. There was no need. At 103 hours into the mission, Apollo 13 passed behind the moon. The radio signal from Earth was cut off, blocked by the lunar body itself. For approximately 25 minutes, the spacecraft was on its own. There was no mission control. There was no help. There was only the moon, the stars, and the soft hum of Aquarius keeping its 3 passengers alive. During that loss of signal, Apollo 13 was farther from Earth than any human beings had ever been. The number depended on exactly how you measured, but the maximum distance was approximately 248,600 miles from the surface of Earth, or roughly 400,000 kilometers. It was a distance record that would stand unbroken by any crewed spacecraft for more than half a century. It would not be surpassed until the Artemis II mission of NASA in the year 2026, when a new generation of astronauts flew slightly further beyond. But on that night in April of 1970 was a record set entirely by accident by 3 men who would have preferred to be much closer to home. While the radio was out, Swigert and Haise drifted to the windows. They had never been here before. They might never come again. Haise, whose entire life had been pointed at this moment, took photograph after photograph of the lunar surface despite the fact that the cameras and film consumed precious resources. He could not help it. The terrain below was beautiful in a terrible, lifeless way, and he wanted to remember it. The far side of the moon is not, as the popular phrase sometimes suggests, the dark side. It receives the same amount of sunlight as the nearest side, just on a different schedule. At the moment Apollo 13 passed behind it, much of the far side was in shadow, but a long, bright crescent of sun-illuminated terrain extended across one limb. Through the windows of Aquarius, the astronauts could see craters that had no name on any commonly published map, because they had not yet been catalogued. They could see basins whose origins were entirely unknown. They could see the curvature of an alien world from above in a way that no telescope on Earth could match. What none of them said, although Lovell would think about it for the rest of his life, was that they were drifting above a place that humans had not yet visited, and would not visit for a long time. The far side of the moon is in a sense the most isolated landscape in the inner solar system. No probe had yet landed there. No human had walked there. It was a wilderness in the oldest sense of the word, untouched by any handiwork of any kind. The 3 men of Apollo 13 in those 25 minutes of radio silence were the only living beings within 400,000 kilometers of it. There was the moon beneath them. There were the stars above them. And there was Earth somewhere behind the moon, blocked from view, waiting. It is impossible to know what each of the 3 men felt during that interval. The cabin recorder was off to save power. The radio was silent. The official record contains almost nothing from the loss of signal until the moment 25 minutes later, when Houston came back into contact. What is left is what each man decades afterward was occasionally willing to say about it. Lovell, when pressed, would describe the experience with characteristic understatement. He had been busy. There had been navigation work to do. He had glanced out the window once or twice, but the photographs that Haise took during those 25 minutes survived. They are now in the NASA archives. They show a lunar landscape no one had ever quite seen before in that light, from that angle, framed by the small triangular windows of a spacecraft that had not been designed for sightseeing. Each photograph is a small act of insistence by a man who had trained for years to be on that surface, who would never get there, and who refused to leave the vicinity of the moon without taking something back with him. A photograph, a memory, a proof. Lovell, watching them, eventually told them to stop. There was work to do. There were 3 more days to go. They needed to focus. When the radio came back, Houston was waiting. The trajectory was good. The spacecraft was on course. But there was a problem with the timing. On the current free return path, Apollo 13 would reach Earth in approximately 150 hours, far too long for the dwindling supplies of water and power. They would arrive home, but they would arrive home dead. The engineers on the ground had been working on a solution. There was a way to shorten the trip by approximately 10 hours using a burn of the descent engine timed for 2 hours after the closest pass to the moon. This was called the PC+2 burn, short for 2 hours past pericynthion, the moment of closest lunar approach. It would also shift the splashdown point from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, where the recovery fleet was already gathered. The burn would be the longest and the riskiest of the entire flight. The descent engine, which had been designed for short, precise firings during a lunar landing, would have to burn for 4 minutes and 24 seconds. The combined vehicle would have to remain stable throughout. The thrust vectors would have to be controlled by hand since the computers were running on minimum power. If anything went wrong, there would be no way to undo it. Lovell took the controls again. The burn began at 105 hours 18 minutes into the mission. The engine fired. The crew felt the gentle push of acceleration. For 4 minutes and 24 seconds the engine ran. The vibrations were steady. The numbers on the ground were good. When the engine cut off, Apollo 13 was on a trajectory that would bring it home in about 63 hours. The moon and the windows behind them began to grow smaller. Lovell looked at it as it shrank. He had now seen the moon up close twice in his life. He had not landed on it either time. He would never see it this close again. No one knew at that moment whether he would see it again at all. He turned away from the window and went back to the navigation calculations. Aquarius with its 3 passengers began the long fall home. The cold after the PC+2 burn the spacecraft entered the longest and quietest phase of the rescue. There was nothing more to do for the next 2 days except to keep Aquarius alive long enough to reach Earth. Every system that could be turned off was turned off. Every consumable that could be rationed was rationed. The lunar module, which had been designed to keep 2 men alive for 45 hours on the surface of the moon, was now being asked to keep 3 men alive for 90 hours in deep space. The only way it could do that was by becoming, in some sense, less of a spacecraft. The first cut was electrical power. Aquarius's batteries in the configuration originally planned for the landing would have run the cabin systems at around 50 amps. The engineers in Houston now ran the numbers and determined that the lunar module needed to be operated at 12 amps. That was approximately the power required to run a small household appliance. It was barely enough to keep the radio working, the basic instruments alive, and the air circulating. Heaters went off. Most lights went off. The cabin fans were dialed down. The carbon dioxide scrubber ran at its minimum. The guidance computer, which had been running constantly, was put into a low-power mode and woken only when needed for navigation checks. The transmission of telemetry to Earth was cut back to the bare minimum. The voice radio was kept active because the voices of the engineers in Houston were one of the few things that kept the crew connected to home. When the heaters were turned off, the temperature inside Aquarius began a slow, steady fall. Within hours it had dropped from a comfortable cabin temperature to something close to the temperature of a refrigerator. Within a day it had settled at approximately 3 degrees Celsius. That was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough to make sleep difficult. Cold enough that on every metal surface inside the cabin, water vapor from the astronauts' breathing began to condense. The walls grew slick with droplets. The instruments fogged. The windows, when the men looked out, were partly obscured by frost. The food packs, which were designed to be hydrated with warm water and eaten warm, became almost inedible. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise put on every layer of clothing they had. They wrapped themselves in the lunar surface coveralls that would have been worn on the moon. They wore the boots. They wore the gloves. They were astronauts dressed for a vacuum, huddling in a cold metal can. Water became another problem. The lunar module's water supply was not large. Most of it was needed for cooling the electronic systems, which had been designed to dissipate heat by evaporating water through small radiators. The crew's drinking water came from the same supply. Every ounce that was drunk was an ounce that could not be used to keep the radios from overheating. Mission Control made a hard calculation. The crew's water ration was cut to approximately 6 ounces per person per day. That was less than a fifth of normal consumption. It was enough to keep them alive. It was not enough to keep them comfortable. Haise, who had been the most active during the early phase of the emergency, began to develop a urinary tract infection. The cold and the dehydration combined into a slow, low-grade fever. He did not complain. He took the small doses of medication that were available in the lunar module's first aid kit. He kept working, but he was by the 3rd day after the explosion visibly unwell. Sleep in any normal sense became impossible. The cabin was too cold for proper rest. The cabin was also too small. 3 grown men in a vehicle designed for 2 had no comfortable place to lie down. They took turns drifting into uneasy half-sleep on the engine cover in the corners near the hatch. They woke often. They monitored the instruments. They listened to the voice from Houston, calm and patient, reading them updates on the trajectory, asking them how they were doing. There is a kind of silence that settles over a small group of people who are working very hard at a single task. It is not the silence of failure. It is the silence of concentration. Inside Aquarius, in those slow, cold hours between the lunar swing and the approach to Earth, that silence came to occupy most of the cabin. The men did not speak more than they had to. They saved their breath. They saved their warmth. They saved their words. What they did say to each other in those hours was small, practical, about the procedures, the readings, the rationing, the small accomplishments of staying alive for another shift. There was no large speech and no philosophical reflection on what they had lost or what they might yet lose. They were professionals. They worked their problem, and they trusted each other. And they trusted the voices on the radio in a way that did not need to be discussed. There is something worth pausing over in that fact. The popular memory of Apollo 13 has tended to dramatize it, to picture the three men white-knuckled and grim gripping the consoles in fear. The reality as recorded in the cabin transcripts and in the recollections of the men themselves in the decades afterward was quieter than that. There were moments of tension, certainly. There were moments of fatigue and irritation. But the dominant emotional tone of those days was not panic. It was concentration. It was the steady, methodical attention of people who had been trained for years to manage exactly this kind of situation, even if no one had ever expected it to come. The men in Aquarius worked. The men in Houston worked. The voices on the radio passed instructions and acknowledgments back and forth across 200,000 miles of vacuum. And the procedures got executed. And the spacecraft kept moving toward home. There was a kind of grace in that work. It was not the grace of heroism exactly. It was the grace of competence, applied without flinching under conditions that would have crushed almost any other group of people. Outside the windows of Aquarius, the stars did not move. They never seemed to move at the speed the spacecraft was traveling against the depth of the universe. Inside the cabin, the breath of the three men formed small clouds in the cold air. The instruments glowed faintly. The radio hissed. The mailbox hummed in its corner, and the Earth, that small wet world they had left, kept drawing them back slowly by the only force that had ever truly mattered. Gravity is patient. It does not hurry. It pulls everything that has ever been thrown into space, and it pulls it always towards something larger. Apollo 13 falling home was being pulled by the gravity of the planet that had built it. Every minute the spacecraft was a little closer. Every hour the Earth in the windows grew imperceptibly larger. The men did not need to navigate that fall. They only needed to keep the spacecraft alive long enough for the fall to complete itself. Below them, slowly, the Earth began to grow. The mailbox. By the second day inside Aquarius, a new problem was beginning to assert itself. It was in some ways the most insidious of the entire flight because it was not visible and not immediately felt. It grew slowly by fractions with each breath the three men took. The problem was carbon dioxide. The lunar module's environmental control system relied on small canisters filled with lithium hydroxide, a white crystalline substance that absorbed carbon dioxide as air was passed through it. There were 2 such canisters in operation at any time. As one became saturated, it would be replaced. The system was designed for 2 astronauts breathing for 45 hours on the lunar surface. With 3 astronauts breathing for nearly twice that long, the canisters were saturating roughly twice as fast as the design had anticipated. The lunar module carried only a limited supply of these round canisters. By the second day of the emergency, the spare canisters were exhausted. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the cabin, normally maintained below 8 millimeters of mercury, began to creep upward. Above 10, the warning light would come on. Above 15, the astronauts would begin to feel headaches and difficulty concentrating. Above 20, they would lose consciousness. The command module Odyssey, sleeping in its powered-down state, still carried a substantial supply of lithium hydroxide canisters. The problem was that the canisters in Odyssey were not round. They were square. The lunar module's filter holders were round. The square canisters from the command module would not fit into the round holders of the lunar module. The 2 spacecraft, although built by the same agency for the same mission, had been engineered by different contractors using different specifications, and no one had ever foreseen a situation in which a square scrubber from Odyssey would need to be mated to a round port in Aquarius. It was on its face an absurdity, a square peg, a round hole, a problem that any child could understand. And the lives of 3 men hung on its solution. The man who took the lead on the ground was an engineer named Ed Smiley. He worked in the Crew Systems Division at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. He had been at home watching the television coverage of the explosion when he was called in. By the time he arrived at the center, the problem had been laid out for him. He had less than 2 days to design, test, and verify a method by which the square canisters from Odyssey could be made to work in the round system of Aquarius. He could use only materials that were already aboard the spacecraft. Anything else would be useless. Smiley assembled a team of about 60 engineers. They spread out across a conference room. On the tables, they laid out the same materials that were available to the crew in space: plastic bags from food storage, hoses from the lunar surface spacesuits, cardboard from the flight plan, duct tape, bungee cords, even socks. The team began to build prototypes. They tried different configurations. They timed each construction. They tested the airflow through each design. By the afternoon of the second day, they had a working device. It looked like a small, ugly box made of plastic and tape. Because of its rectangular shape, someone in Mission Control nicknamed it the mailbox. The name stuck. The construction instructions, when they were ready, were 19 steps long. Capcom Joe Kerwin radioed them up to the crew slowly and carefully while Mission Control listened, and the engineers stood by to clarify any step. Swigert and Lovell did the assembly. Haise, who was running a fever, watched from the side and held things steady when he could. The first step was to take a plastic bag that had been used to store the astronauts' liquid-cooled garments. The bag was placed over the top of one of the square command module canisters. The second step was to tear a piece of duct tape down the middle, lengthwise doubling its length. The tape was then wrapped around the bag and canister to form a seal. A cardboard square cut from the cover of the flight plan was used to give the assembly some structural rigidity. A hose from one of the lunar spacesuits was attached to the lunar module's environmental control system at one end, and to the bag-wrapped canister at the other. A bungee cord held the whole thing in place against the bulkhead. The assembly took less than an hour. When it was done, Swigert flipped the switch on the cabin air cleaner. There was a moment of silence in the spacecraft. The men listened. The mailbox hummed. Air was pulled through the hose, through the bag, through the square canister of lithium hydroxide, and back into the cabin. The carbon dioxide gauge in Aquarius, which had been reading close to 15, began to drop. Within an hour, it had fallen back below 8. The crew could breathe. In Mission Control, the team that had built the device watched the telemetry come down from the spacecraft. The numbers fell and the room let out a long, unspoken exhalation. Smiley said little. He went back to his desk and started working on the next problem. There were still many days to go. The mailbox would later become one of the most studied artifacts in the history of engineering. It would sit in a recreated form in museums around the world. It would be photographed, written about, taught in classrooms. It would be remembered as a moment when a complex technical problem was solved, with plastic bags and duct tape, by 60 people in a conference room working against a clock measured in heartbeats. It is worth noticing something else about the mailbox beyond its mechanical ingenuity. The solution depended on a constraint that in any other situation would have been a punishment. The engineers could use only what was on board. They could not order a part. They could not request a delivery. They could not improvise with anything they did not have. The constraint was absolute, and the constraint was what made the solution possible. With infinite options, 60 engineers might have spent days arguing about the best approach. With only the contents of a spacecraft, they had to converge quickly on whatever could be built. Limitation in this case was not the enemy of invention. It was its precondition. This is a lesson that has not always been remembered in the years since. Modern engineering tends to assume that more resources are always better, that broader supply chains are always safer, that the more options a team has, the better its solutions will be. Apollo 13 suggests otherwise. The team that saved 3 lives did so by accepting completely, and without complaint, the small inventory of materials available in deep space. They did not waste a minute wishing for what they did not have. They built with what they had. The mailbox worked. In Aquarius, the 3 astronauts went back to their cold, slow vigil. The cabin smelled the same as it had before, only with a slight chemical tang from the new canisters. They could breathe. That was enough. The long fall home. In the last day and a half of the flight, the Earth in the forward windows of Aquarius grew. It changed from a small bright dot, indistinguishable from a planet seen from very far away, into something with real visible dimension. The blue began to dominate. The white of cloud systems became individually identifiable. The dark of oceans separated from the brown of continents. The eye began to recognize geography. There the curve of South America. There the brightness of the Sahara. The world they had left was no longer an abstraction. It was waiting. 4 hours before re-entry, the spacecraft needed one last course correction. It was small, only a few feet per second of velocity change, but it was crucial. The corridor through which a returning Apollo spacecraft had to enter the Earth's atmosphere was extremely narrow. If the angle was too shallow, the spacecraft would skip off the atmosphere like a stone off water and be flung back into space, where it would die of exhausted batteries within hours. If the angle was too steep, the heat shield would not protect the cabin, and the spacecraft would burn. The corridor was approximately 2 degrees wide. Apollo 13 had to thread it. The mid-course correction, called MC7, was performed with the lunar module's reaction control system thrusters fired by hand with Lovell, aligning the spacecraft using the Earth itself as a reference. The Sun, the Moon, and the limb of the Earth were used as the navigation triangle. The burn lasted only a few seconds. The numbers on the ground confirmed that Apollo 13 was now flying into the corridor, on a path within tolerance. Now came the most untested procedure of the entire mission. Odyssey, the command module, had been asleep for nearly 4 days. Its systems were cold. Its switches were positioned for shutdown. Condensation had collected on every interior surface. The instruments were beaded with moisture. No spacecraft had ever been brought back from a cold soak this deep. No one knew with certainty whether the systems would come back to life. On the ground, the man who had been replaced by Jack Swigert at the last moment was the one assigned to write the wake-up procedure. Ken Mattingly, who had never developed the German measles he had been exposed to, who had not flown the mission he had trained for, had spent the last 3 days in a Houston simulator working with the engineers to design a sequence of switch flips that would bring Odyssey back from the dead. The standard power-up sequence was hours long. The available battery time made that impossible. Mattingly's revised procedure, written and tested across 16-hour shifts, brought the command module up in approximately 2 hours. Every step had been verified in a simulator on the ground. The procedure was read up to Swigert. He executed it. The cabin lights of Odyssey came on. The instruments began to glow. The radios crackled back to life. The capsule's small batteries, which had not been touched in days, held their charge. The condensation on the panels did not cause any electrical shorts, although it could have. The cold metal of the heat shield, exposed to the deep chill of space for 90 hours, did not crack on re-entry, although that too had been a concern. About an hour and a half before atmospheric entry, the time came to release the service module, the section of the spacecraft that contained the ruptured oxygen tanks. As it drifted away from Odyssey, the crew got their first clear look at the damage. The photographs they took through the small windows became among the most famous images of the Apollo program. An entire panel of the service module, approximately 13 feet long, was simply gone. The interior structure was twisted. Wires hung loose. The Saturn V-era machinery that had carried them across the void had a wound that no engineer would have believed could be survived. A short while later, it was time to say goodbye to Aquarius. The lunar module had done what was asked of it. It had kept 3 men alive for 90 hours when it was designed to do so for 45. It had performed 3 engine burns under conditions for which it was never tested. It had hosted them, sheltered them, breathed for them. Now, in the standard procedure of return, it would be released. It would tumble away into the Earth's upper atmosphere. It would burn up. Lovell radioed Houston before separation. He said a brief, quiet thank you to the spacecraft. He said farewell to Aquarius. It was in the official transcripts only a sentence or two. In the actual cabin, it was something more like the loss of a friend. The lunar module was jettisoned. It drifted backward, its golden foil catching the light of the sun, until it was a small, bright object in the distance. A few minutes later, it would meet the upper atmosphere and become a streak of fire. Odyssey, with 3 men inside, fell toward the Earth alone. The re-entry began at 142 hours 40 minutes into the mission. The spacecraft hit the upper atmosphere at approximately 25,000 miles per hour. The heat shield, the same shield that had been worried about because of its long cold soak, began to glow. The temperature on the outside of Odyssey climbed to nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the cabin remained livable. The crew was pressed back into their seats by deceleration. They were for the first time in many days experiencing wait. A normal re-entry blackout during which the plasma surrounding the spacecraft prevented any radio signal from getting through lasted about 3 minutes. Mission control settled into a long, expectant silence, waiting for the spacecraft to emerge from the blackout and call home. 3 minutes passed. The radio stayed silent. 3.5 minutes passed. Still silent. 4 minutes passed. The room at Houston grew very quiet. Engineers looked at each other. Flight controllers who had not slept in many shifts leaned forward at their consoles. At 4 minutes and 28 seconds after entry interface, the radios crackled. Swigert's voice came through. He was reading the altitude. The spacecraft was through the worst of the heat. It was descending under its drogue parachutes. A few moments later, the 3 main parachutes deployed large red and white canopies that caught the sky. Odyssey, gently swinging beneath them, descended through the warm Pacific air. At 142 hours, 54 minutes and 41 seconds ground elapsed time, Odyssey hit the water. The splashdown was clean. The capsule landed approximately 4 miles from the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima in the South Pacific Ocean southeast of American Samoa. The date was Friday, April 17, 1970. Swimmers from the recovery helicopters were in the water within minutes. The hatch was opened. The 3 men inside came out one by one into the bright sunlight of an ocean afternoon. They were unshaven. They were exhausted. They had each lost more than 10 pounds. Haise was running a fever. Lovell could barely stand. Swigert was the strongest of the 3, and even he was unsteady. They were taken to the carrier. They sat on the deck in the sunshine. Lovell asked how he was, said something simple and modest. He said he was glad to be back. The mission, which had launched into near silence 5 days earlier, splashed down to a global audience that had been watching for 90 hours. Pope Paul VI led prayers in St. Peter's Square. Crowds gathered in Times Square in New York. Mission Control in Houston lit cigars. The audience that had turned away from Apollo 13 before its launch had returned completely in the days that followed the explosion. Television networks broke into regular programming. Wire services filed updates from Houston around the clock. People sat in their living rooms in Tokyo and Moscow and Buenos Aires listening to the voice of an American flight controller. They could barely understand, waiting for the radio to crackle back to life through the re-entry blackout. The world had remembered abruptly that what was happening above their heads was real and dangerous, and was being done by human beings. The novelty had worn off, but the meaning, when meaning suddenly came back, was overwhelming. There is in that arc something almost theatrical. A mission begins forgotten. A mission ends watched by the whole planet. The story bends in a single moment, the moment of the bang. And from that moment forward, every breath taken by the 3 men inside Aquarius is being followed by a world that had not the day before even been able to remember the names of the crew. Apollo 13 had failed at every primary objective. It had not landed on the moon. It had not explored the Fra Mauro Highlands. It had not returned with rock samples. By every measure that mattered at the start of the mission, it was a complete failure. By the only measure that mattered at the end of the mission, it had succeeded. The 3 men were alive. Afterward, after the splashdown, NASA convened a review board. Its job was to determine exactly what had failed inside oxygen tank number 2, why the failure had not been caught during pre-flight testing, and what changes were needed to prevent any recurrence. The investigation took months. It traced the problem back to that 1965 design change, to the unmodified thermostatic switches, to the 8-hour overheat during the launch pad test, to the cooked Teflon and the bare wires and the spark in the tank. The fixes were substantial. The oxygen tank wiring was redesigned. The heaters were reduced in capacity. A 3rd oxygen tank was added to subsequent service modules, located in a separate bay from the others, so that no single explosion could disable the entire system. Additional batteries were added to the command module. New procedures were written for cold start of the spacecraft. Future Apollo missions would carry as a matter of routine the lessons of Apollo 13. 8 months after the splashdown in January of 1971, Apollo 14 launched from the same pad. Its destination was the Fra Mauro highlands of the Moon, the same target Apollo 13 had been unable to reach. The mission was commanded by Alan Shepard, the man whose crew had originally been scheduled for Apollo 13 before being swapped with Lovell's. Shepard, along with Edgar Mitchell, walked on Fra Mauro and collected the rock samples that Apollo 13 had been meant to bring home. The mission was a success. The 3 men of Apollo 13 went on each in his own way with the rest of his life. JimLovell retired from the Navy and from NASA in 1973. He had flown 4 space missions. He had spent more time in space than any other human being of his time. He had never walked on the moon. He moved into the telecommunications industry, where he became an executive at a company called Centel. He retired from corporate life in 1991. He gave talks. He wrote a book with the journalist Jeffrey Kluger called Lost Moon, which became the basis for the 1995 Ron Howard film Apollo 13. He attended commemorations. He told the story year after year with quiet good humor. He used to joke when reflecting on his career that he had been twice a bridesmaid and never a bride. He was at peace with what had happened. He understood eventually that the mission that had failed was the one that the world remembered. Jack Swigert left NASA in 1977. He did not fly in space again. He went into private industry and later into politics. In November of 1982, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives from Colorado's 6th District. He had been campaigning while quietly dying of bone cancer. He was hospitalized in mid-December before he could be sworn in. He died on December 27, 1982, at the age of 51. He never took his congressional seat. His fellow astronauts, including Lovell and Haise, attended his funeral. There was a missing man flyover by aircraft of the Colorado Air National Guard. Fred Haise was assigned to command Apollo 19, which had been planned as one of the later lunar missions before NASA budget cuts canceled the flight in 1972. He never made it to the moon. He stayed with NASA and helped develop the Space Shuttle program. In 1977, he was one of the pilots who flew the prototype shuttle Enterprise on its approach and landing tests, gliding it down to the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base. He retired from NASA in 1979 and joined Grumman Aerospace, where he worked on shuttle support contracts for the rest of his career. He retired in 1996. He continued to speak about Apollo 13 with the same quiet patience that the mission itself had required. The years passed. The Apollo program ended. The space shuttle came and went. The International Space Station was built. New generations of astronauts were trained, none of whom had been alive when Apollo 13 flew. The story became history. On August 7, 2025, at his home in Lake Forest, Illinois, James Arthur Lovell Jr. died at the age of 97. He had outlived his wife Marilyn by 2 years. He had outlived Jack Swigert by more than 4 decades. He was buried in accordance with his wishes at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland, next to Maryland. NASA released a statement honoring his service. Tom Hanks, who had played him in the 1995 film, wrote a brief tribute calling him a man who had gone farther into space for longer than almost anyone of his generation. With Lovell's death, Fred Haise became the only surviving member of the Apollo 13 crew. He continued in his quiet way to attend events and to speak about the mission. He was the last living voice of those 87 hours. The following spring in 2026, the Artemis II mission flew its lunar flyby, carrying the first crew on a NASA-built spacecraft to leave Earth's gravity in 53 years. During that flight, Artemis II surpassed the distance from Earth that Apollo 13 had set in 1970. Haise, asked about the loss of the record his crew had held for 56 years, said only that he was happy to pass it on. The record had been an accident of circumstance, not a goal. He was glad someone else was flying that far. The Apollo 13 story has over the decades settled into the place it now occupies in the memory of spaceflight. It is not like Apollo 11, a story of triumph over difficulty. It is something stranger. It is a story of competence under impossible pressure, of improvisation with limited materials, of trust between men who could not see each other, separated by the deepest of all distances, working a problem together for 90 hours. The phrase that NASA itself has come to use for Apollo 13 is the successful failure. It is a contradiction. It is also an exact description. The mission failed at everything it had set out to do. The mission succeeded at the one thing that in the end mattered most. 3 men climbed into a spacecraft and were almost lost in deep space. 3 men came home alive. The moon, which they had spent 2 years training to visit, remained unvisited by them. It still does. It always will. The gray craters of Fra Mauro, where Lovell and Haise were meant to walk, were walked by other men 8 months later. The sun rises and sets on the highlands now as it has for billions of years undisturbed. Somewhere in the cold dark of cislunar space, the panel of the service module that was blown off on the night of April 13, 1970, is still drifting. Would have escaped Earth orbit during the flight. It would have moved into a long, lonely, heliocentric orbit circling the sun once every year or so. It is too small to track. No one knows where it is now. But it is still out there, a fragment of damaged metal falling through silence, the only piece of Apollo 13 that did not come home. Drift now with that small piece of aluminum in the long, quiet orbit of things that were not lost. The story of Apollo 13 is in the end a story about what people can do when the situation is impossible. A story about trust over distance. A story about patience in the cold. A story about 3 men and the men and women who loved them enough from 200,000 miles away to bring them home. It is also a story that has gone on quietly, working in the background of the half-century since in ways its participants could not have foreseen. Every spacecraft that has flown since 1970 carries some part of what was learned aboard Apollo 13. Every contingency plan written by every space agency in the world has somewhere in its assumptions the example of Aquarius as a lifeboat. Every astronaut sent into deep space has been trained on this principle, that a damaged vehicle properly managed can still bring its crew home. The mission did not just survive itself, it taught the rest of human spaceflight how to survive what comes next. And there is one more thing worth saying before the good night. The men who flew Apollo 13 were ordinary in the ways that ordinary men can sometimes be ordinary. They were husbands and fathers. They were Navy and Air Force pilots. They had small habits and small humors. They were not in their own descriptions heroes. They were people who had been trained for a job, and who did that job under conditions no one had wanted to test. The work they did in the cold cabin of a small spacecraft falling home was the work of attention and care and quiet competence. Those qualities, it turns out, are enough to bring you back from very nearly anywhere. Good night to the engineers in their conference rooms. Good night to the controllers at their consoles. Good night to Jack Swigert, who keyed his microphone and said the words. Good night to Fred Haise, who carried the memory longest. Good night to JimLovell, who at last is at rest. Good night to all of them. And good night to you.